In this first section, let's start off by exploring some of the animation and timeline preferences located within Maya. We can access the preferences either from the menu at the top of the screen by going to Window, Settings Preferences, Preferences, or by clicking this icon right down here next to the Auto Key icon. Here, we can see the options for both our time slider display and our playback options. Now the time slider is basically this little gray bar down here that allows you to basically scrub through or control the position of the current frame or the actual length of the animation inside of your Maya file. Under the time slider display, we can adjust things like the start and the end of the playback, or the actual start and the end of the animation, which I will cover in another means in a second here. We can choose the height of our time slider bar. As you see, as I click 4x, it'll actually change the height and adjust the viewport here. We can actually tell it what types of key ticks or when to display certain key ticks. So let's say you have an animated object. You can tell it to display no key ticks here, or no, basically it'll be a red line when there's a keyframe on that frame. You can have it select only the active objects. So let's say if you have a keyframe on any channel for an object, only, or it'll display it is actively selective. Or you can have it here for any attribute field that is selected inside the channel box. So basically it gives you a few different options. You can also have the key tick size, actually the width of it, I believe by default it's just 1, so it's 1 pixel. But you can adjust this so it'll actually be a thicker line here down on the timeline if you have a hard time seeing it. And it'll actually give you the option of displaying the time code. You'll see if I click here, it'll actually display the time code if you happen to need that. And you can actually turn snapping on and off as well. So typically by default, the snapping is set to every frame. Personally, I've never ran into a time when I needed to not have snapping on, so typically the default settings right here will be good. It's going to be what your Maya scene is set up at when you first open it. And usually when you start an animation, you can actually just go in here and quickly change some of these values, or actually change them down here, which I will get into in just a second. Under the playback settings here, we can tell it what view we want to have updated when we are playing back our animation. By default, it is set to active, which means it's just going to play back in whatever viewport that you have selected here inside Maya. You have the choice of actually choosing all, so if you want to see your animation play back in all the viewports, if let's say you are using all 4 viewports and not just a perspective view or a fixed camera, you can have it play back in all of the viewports. In regards to looping, this tells Maya like how it's going to play through the time slider here once it reaches 30. Once just means it's going to play through once. Oscillate means that once it reaches frame 30, it's going to move back to frame 1 backwards, so it's just going to kind of ping-pong back and forth. Continuous means it's just going to kind of loop through. Once it hits 30, it's going to go back to 1, just kind of play through again. As for the playback speed, we've got our different frame speeds, or the frames per second here. Typically, I've found that you're going to animate at 30 frames a second. Sometimes you'll animate at 60s. There are some games out there where you'll have to animate at 60. Half, I've never had to animate at half, but there's half, and then there's other, which allows you to set your own playback speed. There's one here called Play Every Frame, and typically that's for some type of simulation, whether it's a dynamic simulation, whether it's hair or cloth or something like that. So if you set it to that, you'll see that we can have it determine how many frames it's going to play back and the max speed here. So by default, we're just going to set it back to 30 frames per second here. So that's pretty much the time slider and playback settings. There's also one more area that has some animation settings in it, and that's under here, under animation. What you'll see here is we've got a setting for auto key. Auto key is basically going to set a new keyframe or update a keyframe when we change the value of any object that we have animated. So let's say if I have a sphere and I have a key set on it and I want to move it to, let's say, another frame and change the position of it, it's automatically going to set a key for that new position. We look here under rotation interpolation. Rotation interpolation actually has to do with how Maya handles the rotation curves, basically what algorithm it uses to figure out its rotation curves, and it's a mathematical thing that kind of happens under the hood. We probably won't run into any issues with this, but we may have to make some adjustments during our character animation later if we run into this. I'll cross that bridge when we get to it. We also have some settings for tangent handles. We'll see what those are when we get into our graph editor. It basically has to do with how we control some of the slow in and slow outs, or basically the shape of our curves in the graph editor. And then we've got some additional ones dealing with animation blending and how our graph editor kind of looks and the controls that we have within there, and then some additional stuff within our camera sequencer. But this is what we've covered so far within the time slider and the animation here in these first few settings are pretty much going to get us started here. Next, let's take a look at our time slider and playback controls right here within the Maya user interface. By default, when opening a new scene inside Maya, your time slider should be set to 30 frames, which is actually what you can see right here down on these little dialogues right here. But chances are, if you're creating an animation, this probably isn't going to be the desired length of your scene or animation, so we'll need to change this. In order to do this, you can take either of these boxes right here, and let's say you want to have a 60 frame animation. The box on the left is going to change the overall length of your playback. So if I change this to 60, you'll see that both numbers increase to 60. Now let's say I only want the playback to be from frame 1 to frame 30. If I change that back to 30, you'll see that our playback or our time slider changes to 30 frames, but the other one still stays at 60. Kind of like how we viewed up there in the preferences here. I'll open this again real quick. And we see we have our playback and our animation length. So our playback is how long this time slider is, or where it is, I should say. And the animation length is the number on the right, which actually dictates how long the whole scene or the whole animation is. So you can change these just by typing a numerical value in them. You can change these down here. So let's say I wanted the animation to start at frame 5. See that this automatically changed to frame 5, or I can, let's say, change this to frame 10. So I want my playback range to be from frame 10 to frame 30. Another thing you can do to control where your playback range is you'll see that every time I update this here, if I change this back to 5, or maybe I'll change this to 45, is that this little gray bar down underneath the timeline will actually change its length. And what that's doing is that's actually interactively changing the length of your playback range. So as you can see, I still have a little bit of dark gray space here, and what I can actually do is if I select this gray bar, I can actually move what section of the playback range I want to view. So if I want to, let's say, view the end, I can just move it down there, or vice versa. You can just kind of readjust it however you want. Also, next to the numbers here, you'll see these little gray boxes. The numbers actually indicate your playback start and end. You'll see it's 5, correlates to this 5 over here, and 45 with 45 over here. You'll see these gray boxes. If you click on them, you can actually drag them as well. So instead of having to type a number in, you can just kind of quickly and interactively adjust your playback range using just kind of some of the clicking features here on the interface. So I want to change that back to, let's say, 5, or change this back to 45. I can just click and drag that out. And here you can actually go into negative frames as well. So if I wanted the animation length to start at, say, negative 30, I wanted a 1 second of lead-in of maybe dead space that I wanted to use or just have there for some reason. You can also kind of animate in negative frames as well, so it doesn't have to start on 0 or 1 or anything like that. Once we have our timeline and time slider set up, and we begin creating animation, we're going to want to have some means of actually viewing what we're creating. In order to do this, we can use the playback controls or keyboard shortcuts to view and step through our animation. The playback controls in the user interface are just to the right of where we see our time slider right here. And actually our time slider, and actually let me note as well that this number right here, this number right here next to the time slider is where our current frame is at. So if I hit frame 5, that will go to frame 5, and if I go to frame, let's say 18, it'll go to frame 18, and whenever I change this on the time player, that's what it's going to show here in this box. So back to our playback controls. We'll see that we have all of these playback controls, which will control basically where this is, where the little tick is, or what frame we're going to start on. So if I, let's say, have my frame here currently at 28, and I change it back to tell it to go to the start of the playback range. Now, this is the playback range. This isn't necessarily the start of the whole animation, so just remember that. So if I click back, it's going to go to frame 5, because that's where the playback range starts. I can use this button right here to go back a single frame instead of going back the whole length of the playback range. The one right next to it is going to allow me to go back to just, let's say, the last key. So if I have a key on 30 and I have a key on, let's say, 22, it's just going to take me back from 30 to 22 and then step so on through the actual keys themselves. Both of these right here, this will actually play the animation backwards. And then all of the controls to the right here are basically everything that these controls are that we just went over, except going in the forward direction. So we'll play it forwards, we'll go to the next key forward, we'll step through on a single frame basis, and then we can actually go to the beginning of the end of the animation. Along with these playback controls here on the interface, Maya also has some hotkeys that are set up which will allow you to quickly and easily kind of play back your animation and do some of what we actually just went over here within these icons. By default, to play your animation back, I believe it's Alt-B. Yeah, you'll see that the animation plays back. I actually have it set up to be Control and Space, and I have that because it kind of correlates to some other packages that I'm familiar with using, like say Unreal or Motion Builder. So if you guys are interested in keeping it Alt-B, that's fine. That will actually help you. But if you were interested in changing this hotkey, you can do so by going to Window, Settings Preferences, Hotkey Editor. When this loads up, readjust this window real quick. You'll see that on the left-hand side under Categories, we see our playback controls. And the playback toggle is what I basically have. Oh, I'm sorry, it was Alt-V, not Alt-B. But if we use Alt-V or Control Space, which I have it set up as, that's actually going to toggle the start and stop of our playback. So if I'm testing an animation, instead of having to go over to the play button every time, I can just quickly hit Control Space and the animation will start playing back. So little things like this that kind of help speed up your workflow and are pretty handy. So if you have a preference to what you'd like the playback to be, by all means go to this hotkey editor and set it up. You can do so by, let's say, if I want to remove Control Space. I'm going to go to Remove right there, and now if I close this down, save this, and close, I'm hitting Control Space right now inside the viewport, nothing's happening, but if I hit Alt-V, you'll see that it starts playing. I'm going to hit Alt-V again to stop this. So if I want to, let's say, assign Control Space to this, I can go to Settings Preferences, Hotkey Editor, and go back down to my playback controls. Go to playback toggle, or again, you can set this for any of these commands right here. And let's say I want to use the control, just click that, and then if I go to, let's say, space, it tells me right here Control Space is assigned to nothing. Sometimes if you have or if you want to actually use a key where it's Control 2, it'll tell you, like if N's not controlled anything, H isn't. Okay, right here, if I just click off off this little dialog where it lets me put in the letter, it says Control H is assigned to hide selected objects. So if I go find where hide selected objects is here, I'll have the current hotkeys list here, and I can just select it and click remove. You'll have to do that before you reassign it because you can't assign a single hotkey to two different commands. So with here, I'm just going to hit delete. I'm going to go and put space, and then I'll just hit assign since now it's telling me again that this is assigned to nothing. And you'll see that we have it under the current hotkeys list for this playback toggle command. And I'm just going to save this again and close it. And you'll see that it's going to play back here in Maya when I hit Control Space. So essentially you can do this for any command inside Maya. I set it up this way for my playback controls because as an animator you're always kind of having to, let's say, watch your animation. So it's kind of easy to have some of these tools here, whether it's skipping through frames or actually viewing your animation. So it's kind of a handy thing to have. The last things on the playback or animation control interface are the drop downs for the animation layers, which basically control what layer you're on if you happen to be using animation layers, which we will be a little later in the course. And the character set drop down, which as expected allows you to choose what character set you're working with. What are character sets, you may ask? Well, they're basically a group of bones or controllers or deformers or any other element that make up your character that you can easily control as opposed to having to select them all individually to manipulate your character. So it basically acts as almost like a group node that you can use to control your character with. Character sets are used when working within another animation feature inside Maya called the Tracks Editor, which allows you to do non-linear animation or basically control, blend, or rearrange animation sequences in a clip-like fashion as you would video clips in, let's say, a video editing software. But since we're just going to be covering a single character animation towards the end of this course, the use of character sets in the Tracks Editor is not something we're going to really get too involved in, but it's good to know that you can actually create sets of whole characters and kind of begin to export some of these animations you create and possibly rearrange them in a varied sequence if you wanted to.